The anime opens by depicting the monotonous life of a Japanese salaryman who endured being shoved around on a packed commuter train every morning and barely managed to catch the last train home each night. That dull routine defined his existence until the moment he was reincarnated into another world and appointed as the lord of a remote village he was meant to develop using his abilities. However, one day, he awakens and immediately notices how small his hands have become. Realizing that he is now inhabiting the body of a child, he rushes toward a nearby window and looks outside, only to see an expansive kingdom he does not recognize at all. His confusion is abruptly interrupted when his personal maid panics and hurriedly pulls him away from the window, warning him of the danger. He apologizes for worrying her and explains that the scenery was simply so magnificent that it overwhelmed him. The maid is startled by his vocabulary and wonders where a child so young could have learned such complex expressions. This revelation deeply confuses him, and he realizes that while he possesses vague memories of having lived here before, this situation closely resembles the reincarnation stories he once knew. He correctly identifies the maid as Till, his personal attendant, and when she confirms it, he also realizes that his name is Van Ferdio, often called Van. Till is delighted that he can properly say his family name. To her further surprise, he correctly recalls his father's name, Jalpa, the Marquess of the Fercio house, as well as the names of his three older brothers, Mercia, Jard, and Sesto. However, despite knowing all of this, he remains unaware of his current location. Later that morning, the family gathers for breakfast. Van sees his father, Maris Jalpabul Atio, and his brothers, Mercia Eligo Fercio, the eldest, Jar Giercio, the second son, and Sesto Eleo, the third. During the meal, Van is showered with affection by the maids, who constantly praise and spoil him. Although he privately finds the situation amusing, he accepts it without complaint. From this, he concludes that he has been reborn into this world while retaining all memories from his life in Japan. That is the only certainty he has for now. During breakfast, Maris Ferdio asks his sons about their studies for the day. Jard nervously reports that he will be studying fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto explains that he will focus on magic studies. When Van is asked the same question, he calmly states that there is much he does not yet understand and that he wishes to begin by learning about the nation's culture and history. This sophisticated answer from a 2-year-old shocks everyone present. His father, however, smiles before laughing loudly, clearly pleased. He remarks that he had worried about spoiling Van due to being the youngest child born to his late wife, Mira, but now believes Van to be a fine young lad. Confident that Van will inherit powerful fire magic like both his parents, Maris declares that the future of House Ferdio is secure and eagerly anticipates Van's magical aptitude appraisal at age 8. Through this conversation, Van learns that magical aptitude holds great importance in this world. Individuals with offensive magical abilities are highly valued for their role in protecting society. Noble families strongly desire heirs with aptitude for one of the 4 elemental magics: fire, water, wind, or earth. Those who possess other types of magic are considered disgraceful. Knowing that his father and brothers all possess elemental magic, Van understands the immense expectations placed upon him. Determined to better understand the world, he begins asking Till countless questions. She explains that ships can only safely sail from the kingdom's main port due to massive sea monsters inhabiting the deep ocean. She also tells him about the many races that exist, including elves and dwarves, before being stopped by other maids who worry the information is too complex for him. Van reassures Till that he genuinely wants to learn more. When he asks about magical tools, she eagerly explains the existence of magic crystals, gemstones, and ores capable of storing magic. These materials can be used to create tools aligned with one's magical aptitude. Their discussion is interrupted when the butler, Espada, suddenly places a large stack of books in front of Van. Though aware that Van is officially learning basic literacy and numeracy, Espada wishes to assess his true abilities. Van finds the veteran butler intimidating and nervously admits that his reading is poor and that he can only perform simple arithmetic. Espada immediately tests him by holding up 3 fingers on one hand and 2 on the other. When Van answers correctly, Espada decides on the spot to become his tutor. Unable to refuse, Van is subjected to grueling daily lessons. As a result, he learns to read and write within weeks and spends the next 2 years studying relentlessly from dawn until dusk. By the age of 4, Van begins sword training and often spars with Till, who easily dodges his attacks and teases him. During one such session, other maids intervene, accusing Till of disrespecting a noble. When they demand punishment, Van is confused, as he feels no offense. The head maid explains that such behavior would normally be considered a crime. Instead of issuing a harsh punishment, Van simply flicks Till's forehead and declares the matter resolved, leaving everyone stunned. Van continues studying swordsmanship daily, and by age 5, he can fight evenly with older trainee soldiers. His prior life experience gives him an edge, and soon he gains a reputation as a prodigy. Despite his noble status, he treats children of lower rank kindly and ensures their safety after each duel. During a break, Van meets Dee, the deputy commander of the chivalric order. Dee notices the lack of calluses on Van's hands and realizes that his academic training is far more intense than his physical one. Shocked to learn that he has been studying 3 times harder than others, Van begins to understand how abnormal his upbringing has been. Dee insists on personally training him in swordsmanship, promising to go easy due to his age. This promise proves false, as Van is forced through brutal exercises daily. Though exhausted, Van finds joy in this new life, experiencing a sense of fulfillment he never felt before. By age 6, however, the constant pressure becomes overwhelming. Wanting to enjoy his childhood, Van deliberately decides to slack off. He visits the marketplace for the first time, where he witnesses a man attempting to sell his own child into slavery. Horrified, Van intervenes and purchases the boy, Kamsin, granting him safety. Due to noble restrictions, Kamsin must officially become Van's slave to enter the mansion. Though uneasy, Van agrees for Kamsin's protection. The contract is sealed, and Kamsin begins working at the mansion, eventually growing healthier and more confident. As Van approaches his 8th birthday, anticipation spreads across the kingdom for his magical appraisal. Expectations are shattered when it is revealed that Van possesses no elemental magic and instead has production magic, widely regarded as useless. Enraged, his father nearly kills him before Mercia intervenes, proposing that Van be sent to govern a remote, undeveloped village instead. The proposal is accepted, and Van is exiled under the guise of becoming a lord. Though the situation is grim, Van looks forward to a peaceful, laid-back life. Despite his father's intention to send him away quietly, his departure becomes public due to Dee's actions. As Van leaves the capital, the people gather to give him a heartfelt farewell. Surprised and touched, Van waves back, sincerely thanking them all as he begins the next chapter of his life. The journey toward the new city stretched on longer than expected, the road winding through forests and plains still unfamiliar to Van and his companions. Along the way, Van demonstrated his remarkable affinity for production magic. With a simple gesture and focused intent, he shaped raw materials into usable tools, repairing damaged equipment and creating necessities with ease. His companions watched in awe, whispering among themselves about the rare talent they were witnessing. Yet, despite their admiration, Van himself felt conflicted. While his magic was powerful, he privately lamented its lack of obvious combat applications. In a world where strength often meant survival, production magic felt strangely misplaced in his hands. However, before they could proceed, the carriage came to an abrupt halt. The sudden stop sent a ripple of tension through the group. Looking ahead, they quickly realized the cause. Smoke rose in the distance, and the village gates were surrounded. The settlement was under siege. Van immediately gathered his companions to assess the situation. Dee, ever composed, surveyed the scene and concluded that bandits were responsible. Van observed the formation carefully. Archers surrounded the village from all sides, loosing arrows toward the gate. Yet something was off, the arrows seemed strangely ineffective. The villagers huddled behind the gates, frozen with fear, unable to respond. Van quickly estimated the enemy's numbers. Around 50 attackers, far more than their own party. Dee proposed a direct assault, confident that cooperation would secure victory. One of the hired adventurers objected, arguing that charging an enemy force of that size was reckless. Dee acknowledged the danger but countered that he had fought on the front lines many times. He did not deny that there would be casualties, but insisted there was still a viable way to fight. The adventurer reminded him that their contract only covered escort duty. Risking their lives to defend a village was beyond their obligation. Dee responded firmly, stating that this village was the first territory of his lord, the first place to shelter the people under his rule. If they would not draw their swords now, then when would they? Though the adventurer respected Dee's sense of honor, he insisted that such ideals did not apply to mercenaries. Understanding the mercenaries' stance, Dee nonetheless pleaded that they at least protect Van. Espada immediately objected. He argued that if Dee were to fall, the territory would have no future, even if the village was reclaimed. Then, to everyone's shock, Espada revealed his true capabilities. Despite his advanced age, he was a mage capable of wielding all 4 elements. He proposed a strategy. He would raise a barrier to shield the adventurers while they attacked from afar. Once the enemy focused their attention on the barrier, Dee and his men would strike from the flanks in a coordinated assault. The plan promised a high chance of success. When Van asked if Espada intended to fight, The butler answered calmly that he must. Otherwise, he would serve only as bait, leading to the deaths of Dee and the others. Van refused to accept the possibility of losing his butler. He also urged Dee not to take unnecessary risks. Dee was not just a warrior, but the group's strategist. Losing him would cripple the territory before it could even take shape. Van then offered himself as bait. His mate immediately rejected the idea. Kamsin volunteered as well, but Van refused. He explained that he could not bear to watch someone he loved die. He insisted that Kamsin must live a long life as a free man. Overriding further objections, Van resolved to advance mounted on the carriage, drawing the enemy's attention from the front while the others launched attacks from the sides. He reassured them that his daily swordsmanship training with the vice commander of the knights would keep him alive. Privately, however, Van accepted another possibility. If he died protecting his people, it would be an honorable end for a lord. He silently hoped that if he fell, his body would be discarded and his identity hidden, sparing his family any trouble. The adventurers watched this exchange in silence. Among themselves, they admitted they had never encountered a truly benevolent noble, only arrogant ones. Van was different. One of them, previously reluctant, decided he wished to remain in the territory of Marquis Furcio for a long time. Van suddenly appeared before him, thanking him for accepting the job. Caught off guard, the adventurer admitted that exceptions among the nobility might exist. He decided to fight on the front lines, entrusting his life to Van. When Van hesitated, the man explained that he could not refuse a child willing to risk his own life. His companions agreed, noting that while they often mocked nobles, they had never met one who remembered all their names. Because of this, they chose to trust him. Dee and Espada committed as well. Protecting Van here meant protecting the future of the Marquis family. Still, Espada scolded Van, reminding him that as a lord, he needed to understand the weight of being an heir. The strategy was revised. Espada would maintain the barrier and handle long-range attacks. Dee would take the left flank. The adventurers would take the right. The battle began. The barrier rose, shimmering with layered magic. One adventurer marveled at the mage's power, while another remarked that had he refused, he would have willingly taken Espada's place. He even expressed a desire to see Van become king someday. The invaders fell quickly. Attacked from behind and unable to coordinate, panic spread. Dee's overwhelming presence caused many to flee outright. During the chaos, an enemy attempted to ambush the support group, nearly striking one of the women. Van reacted instantly, cutting the attacker's legs out from under him and finishing the fight with chilling calm. He warned the group to stay alert. By the end, all enemies were subdued and captured. Not a single casualty was suffered on Van's side. After receiving their reward, the adventurers discussed their future. Though the territory promised little immediate wealth, several decided to stay. One had a fixed job elsewhere, but the woman Van saved chose to remain. Others followed. They wanted to see what kind of person Van would become. Van was later scolded harshly by his maid, who demanded that if he ever risked his life again, he should use her as bait instead and never act so recklessly again. Entering the village, Van introduced himself as the new lord. The settlement was in terrible condition. The elderly village chief thanked them deeply and explained that the village had been attacked repeatedly that year. Since Count Ferdinand's time, night patrols had ceased. Van realized that under his father's rule, the village had nearly been abandoned. Van expressed regret, understanding that low taxes made the village a low priority. He declared that complaining was useless and instead proposed solutions. He outlined 3 measures: creating value so the kingdom could not ignore the village, ensuring steady income to hire mercenaries, and independently reforming and developing the settlement. When hope wavered, Espada revealed his status and Van's talent. Expectations soared. Van reduced taxes from 30% to 10%, earning cheers. Reconstruction began immediately. With earth magic and cooperation, the walls were reinforced. Van promised prosperity through unity. Testing his production magic, Van created an object so durable that even a sword could not damage it. That night, when asked about his limits, he admitted he could not sense any. The next day, he decided to build a house. Visualizing the structure, he activated his magic. In moments, a large house stood where none had before. And with it, the foundation of a future was laid. Although the structure is far more suitable for land management than typical elemental magic, making his skill truly intriguing, Van maintains that offensive magic remains superior for protecting people. He reasons that subjects would feel more secure under a lord who masters combat magic. However, Kamsin disagrees, asserting that he would rather live under Van's rule than Lord Jelpaz. He argues that while strength matters in war, people ultimately seek a ruler who improves their daily lives, a need that no one meets better than Van. Astounded that Van built an entire house alone, surpassing the capabilities of ordinary production magic, the villagers become excited. Van agrees to build houses for everyone provided they supply the timber. The village chief also requests new homes, noting that their current ones are collapsing due to harsh weather. Though Van initially finds the prospect of doing all the work at once exhausting, the sight of their miserable living conditions motivates him to radically renovate the village. Van constructs a whole new neighborhood in moments, replacing the old, dilapidated shacks. He explains his method involves pre-planning to avoid inequality. He makes all the houses identical for the time being, promising to customize them with stone once resources become available. Overwhelmed with gratitude, the villagers watch as Van also constructs a simple public bath next to his manor. Plural uses water magic to fill the tub, while Kamsin heats it with charcoal, creating a traditional Goemon-style bath. While Till and Plural enjoy the hot water, they praise Van's brilliance, recalling that even at age 2, his knowledge rivaled that of adults and he was a prodigy who consistently defeated soldier boys in swordsmanship. Meanwhile, Van and Kamsin bathe after a tiring day. Kamsin expresses his desire to become as strong as Dee to protect Van, just as Dee and his men join them in the bath. The next morning, thanks to the combined efforts of the knights and villagers, a great trench is completed around the village. To bolster defenses and secure a water source for drinking and bathing, they decide to turn it into a moat. Espada and his men begin diverting water from a nearby river, digging a trench dozens of meters long while Dee and Kamsin work manually. Van follows behind to reinforce the bottom and sides of the canal, despite the massive scale of the project. A shared goal makes the labor feel light, as they believe that improving conditions will attract merchants and lead to a peaceful future. Although Van estimates the work will take a week, the team works with such vigor that they finish much sooner. By the end of the day, everyone is exhausted except for Dee, who wishes to continue working as a form of training. The following morning, the connection to the river is finalized. Van thanks his men for their hard work over the past day and a half. As they open the gate and water flows into the moat, the village celebrates. Thinking ahead, Van worries about potential flooding during heavy rain and suggests creating a lake behind the village. Espada agrees, noting it could serve as a reservoir during droughts, and they decide to proceed with the plan. Talia marvels at the transformation, noting how the village went from lacking a waterway to having a reservoir lake. An old man expresses his gratitude to Van, relieved that they no longer have to trek to the river just to get water. Van reflects internally that he is glad water is now accessible to everyone, knowing life will become much easier for the entire village. Elsewhere, Panamera and Arte are shown playing and laughing together in their carriage. Panamera advises Arte to get some sleep, noting that the journey to the remote village is still long. The next morning, back at the village, Van is busy with further preparations. Talia observes that their defensive wall is now complete and much sturdier. Van reflects on his technique, noting that he experimented with mixing stones into the earthen wall to make it as strong as concrete. A young boy remarks that bandits won't be able to attack them anymore because of such a formidable barrier. Wanting to ensure even greater safety, Van crafts simple catapults and adds shields to the front so the villagers can fire arrows while remaining protected. Though the village is small, it begins to resemble a fortified city. Dee comments that it is no longer just a village, but a small fortress that bandits could never invade. He laments that if Lord Jelpa's new Van possessed this power, he would have made him the head of the family or a development consultant, as Van's clan is strong enough for combat, perhaps stronger than anyone else. Espada interrupts, chiding Dee for placing too much value on a leader's fighting ability alone, arguing that Van's power is best suited for protection rather than invasion. Van steps in to stop the bickering, stating that resenting their circumstances or talents won't help, and that they must make do with what they have. Later, Van enjoys a meal, deeply impressed by the food. Espada mentions that while protecting the village is vital, they must address its internal economy. He notes they have no connections except for traders who might visit once a month. Van suggests he can provide houses and furniture, and that the village crops are sufficient for food. However, Espada points out they lack spices and the ingredients for the baked sweets Van loves. Frustrated, Van urges the group to brainstorm something the village can sell. Kamsin suggests selling the wooden blocks Van creates or hunting monsters for resources, but Van rejects these ideas. Espada notes that finding something unique to sell from this village will be a challenge. The discussion shifts to weaponry when a young boy, who cherishes a wooden weapon Van made, is mentioned. When Van previously asked the men to test their weapons, they refused, not wanting to damage gifts from him. Van explained that while he was happy they cherished the items, they would not be able to protect themselves if they didn't learn to use them. He discussed a shield made from orcs that was sturdy yet flexible. To demonstrate, Camison struck it lightly, not wanting to break it, but the wooden sword shattered the shield anyway. The boy burst into tears, and everyone was shocked that a wooden weapon could cut with such sharpness. Suddenly, Ortho appears with minerals to sell. He explains that the deep forest at the foot of the Wolfsbrook Mountains is swarming with powerful monsters, which is why they find so many rare minerals without even entering the mountains. He presents iron ore, copper, silver, and even a bit of gold before revealing mithril ore. Ortho explains that mithril is usually only discovered during official surveys by the Knights of Honor due to its rarity. Van realizes that if these are found at the base, the mountains must be full of resources. Van takes the iron ore to use immediately. He experiments with it, noting that since he didn't melt it for purification, he isn't sure of its purity. He decides to make an iron shield for the boy and crafts a sword as well, telling his young customer that he paid extra attention to the decorations. Van uses his magic to craft a longsword, leaving everyone speechless. The adventurers immediately ask him to make swords for them as well. Van asks if his work is truly so well made that even professionals want one, and agrees to craft weapons for the adventurers for free since they provided the raw materials. Plural remarks that while they need to test the weapons to be sure, he believes Van could sell them for a very high price. Plural notes that he hasn't heard much about extracting minerals from forests instead of mountains unless there is a damas, a dungeon or monolith site nearby. Ortho asks if they think there is a damas here, to which Zara replies that no one knows for sure since the area hasn't been properly surveyed. Espada explains that discovering a damas would radically change their situation, as people and goods would flow into the village from everywhere. Van realizes the weight of this possibility. A new damas would cause the village's importance to skyrocket. Espada adds that these sites are national treasures filled with precious gems and resources, and typically, once the guild hears of a new one, they open a branch in the nearest town. However, Espada warns that while adventurers and merchants would come, the village currently lacks the food, infrastructure, and facilities to support them. Ortho suggests they should avoid looking for the damas for now. Plural questions if the Knights of Honor would be sent immediately if news got out, and suggests that Van must develop the village and achieve significant results before the discovery is public. This would make it harder for the Versio family to intervene, as they would otherwise profit more by reporting the discovery themselves. Later, while walking through the village with his maid, Van observes that they are doing well in terms of housing and declares that the temporary renovations are concluded. Suddenly, armored lizards are spotted approaching from the main road. Van immediately takes command, ordering the drawbridge raised and the gates closed. Addressing the frightened villagers, he acknowledges their fear of fighting and injury but emphasizes that everyone's life depends on this battle. He declares that while he will fight for them, he cannot protect everyone with his strength alone, asking them to lend him their strength so they can protect the village together. Motivated by Van's calm but resolute pep talk, the villagers swore to fight to their last breath to protect their home. Fear still lingered in their hearts, but it was now anchored by determination. Van immediately instructed everyone to move to the wall and take positions behind the ballistae, knowing that hesitation would only invite destruction. Compson soon informed Van that Ortho and his party were still out hunting. With the village's strongest fighters absent, a dangerous gap in leadership had formed. Van decided that he would go up to the wall with the villagers to personally oversee the defense. Before he could leave, however, Till grabbed his arm tightly. Tears streamed down her face as she begged him not to put himself in danger. Van hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her, but the situation was too urgent to delay. After a brief pause, he changed his plan. Instead of going himself, he ordered Dee to head up to the wall and relay everything he saw in real time. Van would remain on the ground, issuing commands and coordinating the defense. Dee accepted the order without hesitation and rushed toward the wall. The moment Dee reached the top, he froze. The sight before him was overwhelming. He quickly reported to Van that approximately 40 armored lizards were advancing toward the village. Each monster stood nearly 8 meters tall, massive enough to tower over houses and trees. Their heavy footsteps shook the ground, and their thick scales glimmered ominously. Panic crept into Dee's chest. He knew that even veteran knights would struggle to defeat a single armored lizard. Facing dozens of them with only a handful of trained fighters seemed impossible. Van's voice came through clearly. He ordered Dee to load the iron arrows into the giant crossbows. The knights immediately protested, insisting that ordinary weapons would never pierce scales tougher than steel. Dee silenced them. He was fully aware of the risk, but Van had proven himself time and time again. Trusting his instincts, Dee ordered everyone to load the ballistae and fire. The arrows vanished upon impact. For a brief moment, Dee thought the attack had failed. Then he realized the truth. The bolts hadn't bounced off, they had punched straight through. Wherever the iron arrows struck, massive holes tore through the lizards' bodies. Seconds later, the monsters collapsed, their enormous inertia carrying them forward before they finally hit the ground. In the first volley alone, 10 armored lizards were slain. Dee stared in awe. Not only were Van's weapons far more powerful than expected, but the villagers' aim was remarkably precise. He rallied them for a second round. The knights warned him that they had only one iron arrow left per ballista. Dee ordered them to fire anyway. More lizards fell, but when the dust settled, half the pack remained. Worse, they were completely out of iron ammunition. Dee relayed the grim news to Van. As the remaining lizards continued their advance, Van desperately searched for a solution. Then he remembered something crucial. Kamson's wooden sword had once cut through Fatty's high-spec shield. If that was possible, then perhaps. Van ordered Dee to switch to wooden arrows. The knights reacted with disbelief, calling the idea absurd. Wood could never penetrate hide tougher than steel. Dee shut them down immediately. Van had shattered their assumptions repeatedly, and Dee chose to trust him once more. He ordered the villagers to load the wooden arrows and fire. To everyone's shock, the wooden arrows pierced the lizards. Though the shafts embedded only halfway into the thick scales, they penetrated deeply enough to strike vital organs. One by one, the monsters collapsed instantly. Laughing in disbelief, Dee ordered another volley and declared that they would be feasting on lizard meat that night. Arrows rained down until the final armored lizard fell. Dee proudly announced their victory to Van. Cheers erupted across the village. Till hugged Van tightly, while Van stood stunned, struggling to comprehend that his wooden weapons had defeated monsters of such power. On the wall, the knights marveled that no one had been injured and that they still had plenty of ammunition left. Dee felt a slight disappointment the battle had ended too quickly, proving just how overwhelming Van's abilities were. Soon after, Ortho's party returned and began directing the processing of the lizard corpses. Eyes, fangs, skin, and magic cores were set aside for sale, while the meat was preserved. Ortho noted that armored lizards were usually difficult to process, often causing the meat to rot. Thanks to Van's knives, the work proceeded effortlessly. That night, the village held a massive celebration. Ortho's group praised Van's weapons, prompting Dee and the knights to demand swords of their own. Van refused payment but promised to craft them later. Later, Ortho explained that while armored lizards sold for 20 gold coins, spoilage would reduce profits. Even so, the earnings were massive. Espada then revealed the harsh truth. Half would be taken as tax by the Marquis. Devastated, Van agreed to report the victory to Mercia, crediting his elder brother instead. The next day, 2 merchants arrived, shocked by the fortress-like wall. Van greeted them atop the gate. Recognizing the Marquis's genius son, they introduced themselves as Bell and Rango of the Merry Chamber of Commerce. Once allowed inside the village, the merchant brothers were escorted to the warehouse. The moment they stepped inside, they froze in shock. Piled high were scales, claws, hides, and bones from armored lizards, quantities that seemed impossible for a small, nameless village to harvest. While the brothers struggled to process the sight, Van calmly asked if they were interested in buying the stock. The merchants agreed immediately, but requested a month to arrange a proper team and transportation. Van accepted without hesitation. He even offered them the lizard meat for free, explaining that without refrigeration, it would simply rot. Next, he displayed the weapons he had produced. The craftsmanship left the brothers speechless. The quality far exceeded their expectations, and they accepted Van's asking price without attempting to bargain. When Van asked them to help promote the weapons, the brothers hesitated, clearly hoping to monopolize the trade. Van noted that others would eventually discover the village anyway and proposed a different plan, establishing a permanent shop directly within the village. The brothers instantly saw the profit potential and agreed. Before they could fully process the agreement, Van used his magic to construct their dream shop right before their eyes, cementing a partnership. Shortly after, the village received 2 unexpected visitors, a noble girl and a formidable female knight. Around the same time, Espada gave Van new homework, instructing him to plan a city for 10,000 people, predicting the village would grow at an unprecedented pace. When asked for his vision, Van rejected standard square layouts. Instead, he proposed a star-shaped fortress designed to force attackers to waste time navigating multiple defensive choke points. Espada praised the tactical advantage of the design. Soon, a red-haired knight announced the visitors' arrival as emissaries from Ferdinando County. The knight introduced herself as Panamera, a viscountess who had risen by merit, while the nervous noble girl was Arte, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando. Panamera bluntly asked if Van understood their purpose. She explained that the Count feared Marquis Jalpa was using his genius son to prepare for an invasion. However, Panamera admitted she had a different theory, She suspected Van had been exiled for lacking elemental magic. Van confirmed this openly. He explained he had been kicked out with nothing but his luggage. Dee and Espada added that they had remained behind solely out of loyalty and admiration for Van's character. To settle the matter, Van decided to demonstrate his abilities. Outside, Espada raised a temporary earthen wall. Van then used production magic to process the mud into solid concrete and formed a sturdy wooden gate. Panamera and Artie were stunned. Van explained that production magic, considered the weakest form, was the reason for his exile. This revelation struck a chord with Artie, who seemed to recognize her own situation in his story. Panamera then moved to her second objective, formally offering Artie's hand in marriage. Van understood this as a political move to prevent conflict and declined, stating he desired only peace. Panamera admitted she had initially opposed the idea but had come to respect Van's character, jokingly adding she would marry him herself if she could. When asked directly, Artie shyly admitted she hadn't considered marriage yet. Van encouraged her to take her time. Realizing they needed a place to stay, Van promptly built an inn using his magic. During dinner, Van bonded with Arte over her love for cute things. Later, Panamera left them alone, and Arte quietly told Van he was a nice person before retreating to her room. Back at his mansion, Espada shared a realization. Since Arte was sent to a nameless village to marry, she likely lacked elemental magic as well. Understanding that Arte might be an exile just like him, Van resolved to let her stay in the village if she wished, regardless of whether marriage ever became part of their future. The following morning, Till and Kamsen hurriedly woke Van, insisting he accompany them to Lake Van, the body of water he had recently created. Van was dismayed to learn the villagers had named the lake after him, immediately resolving to stop them from naming the village similarly. Upon arrival, Dee and Espada revealed the source of the commotion, a rare mermaid hiding in the water. Espada noted how unusual this was, as mermaids typically inhabited deep, pristine forests to avoid human pollution. When the mermaid refused to respond to questions, Van devised a plan to lure her with food. He ordered Till and Kamsen to bring roasted meat. The scent drew her in, and after eating, she realized it was the meat of an armored lizard. She asked who had defeated the beasts, and the villagers unanimously credited Van. Seemingly satisfied with this answer, the mermaid vanished underwater, leaving Espada skeptical that such shy creatures would return. To everyone's surprise, the entire mermaid clan arrived at Van's door the next day. The intimidating Mermaid King stepped forward to thank Van for feeding his daughter and asked for confirmation regarding the armored lizard's defeat. Van tried to humbly credit the village's teamwork, but the mermaids were awestruck that a child had killed such powerful monsters. Suddenly, the king proclaimed Van a hero and offered his daughter, Lada, in marriage. Van was taken aback, pointing out that Lada was a mere child who couldn't possibly grasp the concept of marriage. He pressed the king for the true reason behind this offer. The king solemnly explained that armored lizards had recently invaded their territory, killing many of their kind. Desperate for safety, he was willing to marry his daughter to any hero capable of destroying their predators. Understanding the logic, Van assured the king that marriage was not necessary to ensure their safety. He told the king to let Lada marry whomever she chose when she grew up, promising to help the mermaids simply out of goodwill. Grateful, the Mermaid King asked if his people could reside in the lake. Van agreed and immediately constructed 2 floating rest houses in the center of the lake, making the mermaids feel instantly at home. When Espada reminded Van about the sewage issue, the curious king offered his assistance. After Van explained the village's architecture and the flush system used to manage waste, the king volunteered his people, who were skilled at water manipulation, to handle the job in exchange for a safe living space. Thanks to them, the work became significantly easier. Just then Artie and her mommy, Panamera, arrived and were shocked to see the mermaids. The Mermaid King referred to Van as his son-in-law and thanked him, which shocked the human girls. Panamera asked Van if he had married a mermaid despite Artie being first in line. Before he could clear up the confusion, Lada proudly declared herself Van's wife. This escalated the tension between Van and Artie, so he invited Artie for a boating session the next day to clear the misunderstanding. On the boat, Artie revealed she had already heard the details from Panamera and was no longer confused. As she praised Van for building the lake and developing the village, Lada appeared, overcome with jealousy at seeing her husband with another girl. Other mermaid children surrounded the boat, chanting praises of Van as the meat lord while rocking the vessel. The motion caused Artie to accidentally fall onto Van. While the children stared in curiosity and Artie became nervous, Lada's jealousy peaked. She demanded to know what the strange girl was doing with her husband. Van reminded her that he had turned down her father's offer, so they were not even engaged. Lada pouted and went underwater, prompting the other mermaid children to yell at Van for bullying their princess. They proceeded to rock the boat violently, Artie clung to Van, who tried unsuccessfully to bribe the kids with meat. Later, the Mermaid King confronted Van. He stated that he had heard from Lada that Van was flirting with another woman despite being married. Although Arte was terrified by the king's stern expression, Van firmly clarified that he had never agreed to marry Lada. Unwilling to listen to logic, the king declared a competition between the merfolk and Van's people. If the merfolk won, Van would officially recognize the marriage. Van intended to refuse, but Dee suddenly accepted the challenge on his behalf, promising victory as the deputy commander of the Knights Order. Espada agreed, arguing that settling the issue quickly would give Van more time for his studies, and Panamera concurred. Although Van protested that losing would result in a forced marriage, Till and Kamsin assured him that defeat was impossible. Unable to stop his friend's blind faith in him, Van reluctantly agreed. The Mermaid King proposed a 3-event competition to ensure fairness, allowing Van to pick the first event. Instead of choosing an event where he held a clear advantage, Van selected water polo, reasoning it would be equally difficult for both sides as no one knew how to play. After creating a pool within the pond and explaining the rules, Van was praised by Till for his obscure knowledge. Panamera noted that the swimsuits Van made were garnering attention. While Dee showed off his physique, Van asked Panamera if she would participate. She affirmed that she needed him to marry Artie, not the princess, and would do whatever it took to protect him. The game began with Panamera and Till representing Van's village against Lada and her father. The Mermaid King immediately scored a service ace, and the mermaids began overwhelming the humans. By halftime, the point difference was massive, and Till began to lose hope. However, Panamera, furious at his resignation, asked if his loyalty to Van was so fragile. Her words fired Till up, and together they began closing the gap in the second half. At match point, everything hung on the final play. Panamera jumped to block the Mermaid King's spike, but he got past her, and Till failed to defend. The mermaids won the first round. Van was unhappy to see Panamera acting hopeful despite the loss. The Mermaid King then proposed the second event, a swimming relay race. Van realized the impossibility of beating mermaids in water, but Dee insisted it would be barely an inconvenience, and Kamsin volunteered to join him. The race began with Lada and Kamsin. As expected, Lada took a comfortable lead, swimming underwater to travel faster. Kamsin struggled to keep up but managed to tag Dee. Dee immediately utilized the butterfly stroke, which the knights explained allowed him to use his full muscular strength. He rushed forward like a motorboat, overtaking the mermaid and winning the race. The Mermaid King was in disbelief, while Dee walked out of the pond proudly, unaware that the water pressure from his speed had torn off his swimwear. Still unable to digest the defeat, the Mermaid King asked Van to pick the third and final game. Van devised an idea that would be fair for both sides, a shave ice eating contest. He created an ice shaving machine and asked Pluriel to create ice, which he then flavored with syrup. Van announced that he would participate himself, and Artie shocked everyone by volunteering as his partner. The 4 participants sat with huge bowls of shaved ice. Panamera whispered to Artie that it wasn't too late to switch, but Artie refused to stop fighting for her future husband. Upon Espada's signal, everyone began consuming the ice. Immediately, they were all struck by intense brain freeze. Determined to secure the marriage, the Mermaid King powered through the pain, with Lada following his lead. Van feared they would lose, but Artie overcame her brain freeze and began eating steadily, 1 spoon at a time. Her resilience gave Van the courage to rejoin the fray. After an intense struggle, Van and Artie finished their bowls first, winning the competition. The Mermaid King gracefully accepted defeat, and Van was relieved that the pressure to marry Lada was gone. However, the king still referred to him as his son-in-law, stating that Van had proven himself even more worthy of his daughter before departing. Perplexed, Van wondered what the point of the competition had been. Suddenly, his stomach began to hurt from the excessive ice, and his friends gathered around to check on him. Watching from the side, Panamera told Artie she had done a good job, but Artie could only watch Van surrounded by his loyal friends, wondering how she could ever enjoy that kind of attention. She reflected on her past, neglected since birth by a workaholic father and a mother who abandoned her to backpack across Europe. Artie had grown up lonely, timid, and perceived as unintelligent. Her only talent was marionette magic, which she had hoped would impress her mother. Instead, her mother had slapped her, deeming the magic evil in the hands of nobles, and abandoned her completely. At age 10, she was sent to marry the lord of a nameless village. She had been worried, but Van turned out to be kind. Despite having what was considered a useless type of magic, he remained confident and beloved. Inspired by seeing him now, Arte decided to practice her puppetry magic relentlessly, so that one day, she too would be loved for it. The next day, Van gathered the villagers for construction work, hyping them up with the promise of a barbecue party that night. Artie approached him to greet him, asking if she could observe his work, as she wished to become more like him. The narrative shifts to Van, who stands before the newly expanded city walls of Panamera, filled with a profound sense of satisfaction. His eyes sweep over the reinforced towers, noting the undeniable progress from the settlement's humble beginnings. The residents murmur with admiration at the speed of the transformation, while the girl Panamera cannot hide her astonishment at Van's constant ability to surprise her. Van explains that a strong city must always look toward the future. To accommodate the influx of resilient merchants and adventurers drawn to the strategic hub, he has commissioned new housing. Panamera listens with admiration, her own dream being to one day build a true empire. However, her focus shifts to a massive structure looming before them. Van identifies it as a ballista, a siege engine he has significantly modified. He explains that he redesigned the mechanism to launch 2 projectiles simultaneously, vastly increasing its destructive output. They decide to test the weapon. The ballista fires with a deafening roar, the twin bolts tearing through the air and obliterating part of a nearby mountain. As the dust settles, a stunned silence falls over the group. The power exceeds even Van's expectations. Panamera immediately attempts to buy the weapon. When Van refuses, she reminds him that he owes her a favor. Van agrees to gift her 1 ballista, but on the condition that she will owe him a return favor in the future. Confident in her abilities, she accepts. They briefly discuss logistics, arranging for a reinforced carriage to transport the heavy weapon and speculating on methods to mass-produce the iron bolts. During this exchange, a knight suggests Panamera acquire a sword from Van. She refuses, claiming her current blades are superior. To prove a point, Van takes one of her swords and shears through it with his own blade as if cutting a dry twig. He reveals his sword is merely ordinary iron, leaving Panamera shocked. When he confirms the ballista is made of the same refined material capable of piercing multiple armored lizards at once, she promptly orders extra ammunition to reinforce her own defenses. Their tranquility is shattered by shouting adventurers fleeing toward the city. Behind them, a forest dragon tears through the sky, its wings creating a thunderous echo. Van immediately shifts gears, intending to buy time for the civilians to evacuate. Panamera, eager to repay the favor of the ballista, steps up to assist. Van apologizes for the danger, noting that this beast is far deadlier than anything they have faced before. He orders his maid to summon reinforcements, including D, while he and Panamera hold the line. The dragon's presence instills primal fear in the defenders. As it swoops down, Panamera scales the wall with incredible agility. She delivers a massive strike that nearly grounds the beast, but the dragon is resilient. Though wounded and bleeding, it continues to rise, ignoring the pain. Van realizes their previous victories against lesser monsters may have made them overconfident. This is a threat on a completely different level. Van orders the ballistas to fire. The bolts streak across the sky, damaging the dragon's wings, but the creature skillfully dodges the fatal blows. On the ground, the battle becomes desperate. Panamera misses a strike, then lands a second, terrifying blow, yet the dragon persists. Suddenly, Espada enters the fray. Ignoring Van's order to retreat, he executes a heavy stone strike to delay the monster. The attack leaves Espada immobilized, with only one ally standing by his side as the others pull back. Seeing the creature approach the wall, Panamera prepares to advance again. Van stops her, asking if she can repay her favor to him right now. He quickly outlines a desperate plan. When the dragon reaches the wall, Panamera must use her magic to paralyze it completely. This will create the perfect, stationary opening they need to end the fight with a devastating barrage of ballista fire. Reinforcements arrive in the form of D and his companions, but they are initially thrown back by the dragon's overwhelming power. Espada steps in, using his ability to buy a few precious seconds for the others to retreat. Seeing the opening, Van signals Panamera. She executes her strike immediately, her magic paralyzing the dragon at the critical moment. Van shouts the order, and the ballistas fire in a near-simultaneous volley. By a narrow margin, the heavy bolts pierce the beast's defenses, bringing the forest dragon crashing down. D rushes in to finish the fight. He narrowly dodges a final, desperate snap of the dragon's jaws before countering with precision. The creature collapses, raising a massive cloud of dust as the battle ends. Panamera approaches Van, congratulating him on leading the defense against such a catastrophe. Van hesitates to take credit, but she argues that an ordinary village would have been annihilated. She points out the rarity of allies like Espada and D, and the terrifying efficiency of the ballistas that pierce dragon scales. Van, ever the perfectionist, merely grumbles that he wants the weapons to fire 10 consecutive times without failure. Panamera dismisses his technical fretting. All that matters is the victory. She urges him to announce the triumph immediately. At the guild, Van declares the defeat of the forest dragon, the Lord of the Forest. Panamera emphasizes the miracle that a small village defeated such a threat without a single fatality. The city celebrates the beginning of a new era. Honors are distributed to the key players. D is officially recognized as a dragon slayer. Espada receives a title for his tactical mastery. His magic was essential in containing the monster to create openings for the others. Finally, Van is named. Despite being only 8 years old, his quick reasoning, unprecedented construction magic, and ability to organize a defense against a legendary beast earn him the title Lord of the Two Lands. It is a designation carrying significant political weight. As the celebrations continue, the narrative shifts to Panamera's internal thoughts. Having risen from knighthood to nobility, she has known ambitious soldiers and proud nobles, yet she has never met anyone like Van. He possesses a confusing mix of genius, boldness, and a visionary eye for the future. Panamera's own path was forged in fire. Born in the capital to a traditional family of knights, she was raised on strict discipline. When her magical aptitude appeared, she was sent to train under a count renowned for refining talent. The training was brutal, demanding physical endurance and tactical mastery that broke most students. Panamera persevered, refusing mediocrity. She rose to become a platoon leader and eventually a commander. Her military successes were so undeniable that Her Majesty granted her the title of Viscountess, a rare achievement for a young woman who earned her rank through merit rather than inheritance. Panamera reveals she was originally in the region on orders from Count Ferdinand. The mission was to oversee the security and negotiation of a marriage between the Count's youngest daughter and a local lord to strengthen alliances. However, upon arrival, the prospective bride became interested in Van instead. Accustomed to evaluating political landscapes, Panamera realized Van was not just a talented boy but a convergence point for power. While the regional marquis had offered no aid, Van had strengthened his city and slain a dragon. Panamera decides to pivot. She proposes an alliance to Van. If the village comes under her official protection, Count Ferdinand's knights will pose no threat. Furthermore, the alliance would create an axis of military and commercial cooperation, accelerating the city's development. Van listens, quickly grasping the strategic value. Reducing enemies and gaining powerful allies is a basic principle of survival. Recognizing this as a unique opportunity to consolidate what he has built, Van accepts. The deal is struck, marking the end of the battle and the beginning of a promising political future for the territory. The day after their victory against the wild dragon, Van and Esparta discuss the village's future. Since Van's newly built fortress walls successfully served their purpose during the battle, Esparta suggests shifting focus to broader village planning. He envisions a bustling city capable of housing 10,000 people. Van agrees, and they decide their first step is attracting new residents to transition the remote village into a true city. Their planning is quickly interrupted when Till enters to announce the arrival of the merchant brothers, Bell and Rango, along with senior merchants from their company. Excited, Van postpones city planning to sell the harvested forest dragon materials. In the warehouse, the brothers explain that a large forest dragon is incredibly rare. Because its scales, claws, and eyes are in pristine condition, they estimate the parts could easily fetch 100 platinum coins, a fortune capable of making someone a millionaire in the real world. Meanwhile, the senior merchants carefully examine the carcass and quietly plot their strategy. When Van asks for their professional assessment, the veterans enthusiastically rub their hands together, claiming he won't find better partners. They promise their highest price available, a mere 60 platinum coins. Realizing this offer is drastically lower than the brothers' earlier estimate, Van decides to consult Bell and Rango again. This panics the senior merchants, who fear the inexperienced brothers will ruin their scam. They corner Bell and Rango, demanding they play along to maximize profits from what they perceive as a clueless child. The brothers refuse, arguing that honest merchants must provide fair value. The veterans scoff, confident Van has no other choice in such a remote location. Overhearing everything, Van is about to intervene when Bell and Rango proudly declare their commitment to honesty, believing it yields greater long-term returns. Furious, the veterans curse the novices and threaten to expel them from the prestigious Merry Chamber of Commerce. After the veterans storm off, the brothers admit they will likely be fired, as higher-ups usually side with seniority. Van casually suggests they start their own trading company. Thoroughly shocked, they explain the immense difficulty. It requires paying a merchant guild registration fee, acquiring a shop, and the hardest part, securing a formal endorsement from a titled noble. Knowing only one titled noble, Van immediately asks Panamera for the endorsement. She agrees without a second thought. When Van warns her that the Merry Chamber is backed by the royal family, Panamera brushes it off. She doubts a gigantic company will care about a minor noble supporting a two-man enterprise, and she welcomes the positive reputation of helping honest merchants establish themselves. Seizing a chance for favorable publicity, Van suggests Panamera take credit for slaying the dragon. This would conveniently keep Van's family from discovering his involvement. Panamera rejects the idea, explaining that slaying a dragon triggers independent investigations that would inevitably trace back to Van and Dee anyway. Devastated, Van fears his family will summon him and seize control of the village. Panamera advises that the only way to protect his claim is to acquire his own noble title. As a marquis' son, he could easily obtain a baron title directly from the king, but only if he claims the glory of the dragon kill. Van panics, wanting no part of the clout. Panamera insists it's his only option, sympathetically recalling how she incinerated her own enemies to assert dominance. She encourages Van to ruthlessly fire his ballistae at anyone who challenges him. Unsure what to do with this highly illegal advice, Van asks if she needs the glory herself. She fiercely replies she doesn't need a child worrying about her career. Van returns to Belle and Rango with news of Panamera's backing. Overjoyed that they can open their own company, the brothers purchase the dragon parts for a generous 130 platinum coins and prepare for the capital. However, the greedy senior merchants have stolen all the carriages. Undeterred, Van uses his magic to build them a brand new carriage, and Panamera lends them her exceptionally powerful war horses to ensure a swift journey. Meanwhile, on the road, the greedy senior merchants laugh amongst themselves, assuming the brothers will soon come crawling back without transportation. Their amusement shatters when Panamera suddenly overtakes them in a newly built carriage. The veterans quickly realize the brothers are successfully forming their own company with a noble's backing. Soon after, Panamera reaches the royal capital and requests an audience with King Dino. When the king asks if she is seeking another promotion, Panamera clarifies she wants a noble title for a friend. Intrigued, King Dino asks why this friend isn't present. Panamera explains he is busy protecting a faraway village but has already achieved magnificent things. She reveals the person is 8-year-old Van, the youngest son of Marquis Ferdio, and states he single-handedly defeated a forest dragon. This declaration sends the court into a frenzy. The king assumes Van must be a powerful elemental mage, but Panamera clarifies the boy possesses production magic. She recounts Van's astonishing exploits, explaining how he defeated bandits alongside a small group before using his magic to transform a rundown settlement into a stronghold. Finding the story difficult to believe, King Dino is finally convinced when Panamera presents a dragon fang as undeniable proof. She invites the king to visit the village, confident the fortress will secure Van's promotion. The king agrees and officially grants Van the title of baron. Panamera publicly announces the decision, eager to stir up gossip and see how interesting things become. Back in the village, Van is completely unaware of his new title. He remodels existing houses and builds several new ones to increase capacity, along with 2 tall watchtowers to serve as a symbol of their growing civilization. While enjoying lunch atop a tower, Esparta suggests renaming the settlement Vantown. Though Van is annoyed and doesn't want his name used as a brand, everyone else enthusiastically agrees. They celebrate the progress with cake baked by Till, using fresh ingredients from Belle and Rango's newly established shop. Their peaceful afternoon breaks when they notice a group of people at the town gate. Van investigates and finds dirty, starving individuals searching for Seto Village, the settlement's unofficial original name. The refugees explain they fled a neighboring village in Ferdinand County. Their local lord conscripted all the young people into his army, leaving them with a depleted workforce and crippling taxes. Hearing rumors of miraculous changes in Van's territory, they came seeking relief. Though Van realizes accepting refugees from Ferdinand County is politically risky, he cannot abandon desperate people. He takes them in, offering them citizenship. When the tearful leader admits they cannot pay taxes, Van promises them temporary tax relief, warm houses, and plenty of food, leaving the villagers feeling they have found heaven on earth. Learning that 300 more people remain at their original settlement, Van offers to dispatch adventurers to safely escort them. The deeply emotional leader asks how they can ever repay this kindness. Van humbly brushes it off, promising to send carriages for their belongings. However, the leader notes they already have 10 cows to transport their luggage. This thrills Van, as the cattle will allow him to finally start a dairy and enjoy milk products. Ortho and his party of adventurers are immediately dispatched to escort the remaining villagers. Though some adventurers question the logic of Van's charity, their green-haired companion tells them to focus on the task. The group comforts the relocating villagers, and Ortho reassures a doubtful, exhausted woman that their destination is nothing short of paradise. Upon arriving at Vantown, the disheartened refugees are greeted by a massive barbecue. Disbelieving the high quality of the food, the starving people eat with tears of joy. Afterward, they approach Van to ask for work, fearing expulsion if they don't contribute. Van outlines his plans, explaining they can work in agriculture and run his new stores. When they worry about lacking business knowledge, Van eases their fears, telling them to leave administrative tasks to educated personnel. The former village chief arrives to warmly welcome the guests, praising Van for improving their standard of living. Overwhelmed by the unprecedented hospitality, the refugees are treated to one final surprise: cakes prepared by Van using milk from their own cows. He promises their lives will only improve as Vantown becomes a full-fledged city. For the first time, the refugees finally feel they can truly live, rather than just survive. Thank you for watching this week's anime recap. If you liked the video, please help this channel by leaving a like and subscribe to help us reach our goal of 30K subscribers.